So, dear colleagues, I would like to announce the continuation of our session. And Sofia Miguens from University of Porto, Portugal, will present us her talk on 2 ways of being unable to go wrong when encountering oneself. And where am I or what? So, please.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you. Does this work? Thank you very much for this, for the invitation to this wonderful, this amazing city, and it's already been a pleasure to participate in this amazingly organized, beautifully organized conference. Thanks especially to Anastasia for being so wonderful with us all. Since yesterday, I was actually thinking it might have been better when I listened to Danilo to present a paper on animalism as approach to personhood that I've been working on, but my paper is on encountering oneself, so we are stuck with it for today. So I should say that we have a handout. I don't know if everybody has a handout, mostly because I'll probably be skipping quotes. There's an extra one here. In the conclusion of the first book of his treatise of human nature, David Hume asks rather dramatically the question on my title, where am I or what? I will call this Hume's question. I want to begin with some examples of very different ways we risk going wrong when we try to answer Hume's question. That was my motivation for this paper. If we consider, for instance, the literature of philosophy of language and philosophy of self-knowledge, we find the quite well-known Mach, Castaneda, or Perry cases where we have person A having thoughts about B without realizing that B is A and that he is A. For instance, Mach's famous footnote in his book, The Analysis of Sensations, Mach's shabby pedagogue. Not long ago, after a trying railway journey by night and much fatigued, I got into an omnibus just as another gentleman appeared at the other end. What a shabby pedagogue is that has just entered, thought I. It was myself. Opposite me hung a large mirror. That's Mach, 1885, The Analysis of Sensations. If we consider cognition, we come across experimental paradigms that you probably know of, such as the rubber hand illusion, where I'm certain that this hand I see in front of me is my hand and that I feel it being touched, yet it is an artificial hand, a rubber hand. If we also come across pathologies such as schizophrenia, where we can come across patients with verbal hallucinations who might report thoughts suddenly occurring in them, but they are not authored by them. Let us imagine, for instance, the thought, kill God. If we prefer thought experiments, you might know Evans' varieties of reference, and that there this scenario comes from there. The scenario is the following. Let us imagine that I'm here, and I think, if I were sitting, that my legs are crossed. They are mine, and I feel them. I cannot possibly be wrong, or can I? What if wires were messed up with and my brain is getting stimulation from B's legs? Can I feel legs that are not mine, as me? Anyway, these are the cases. I said this was my motivation for writing this paper on encountering myself. These are completely disparate phenomena. I'm not claiming that they should be treated similarly. They're phenomena about authority or lack thereof, or lack of authority in self-identification, yet they have motivated my leading question for today, which is, if all of this is possible, is there any way one is simply unable to go wrong when encountering oneself? And what I will do here, basically, is to compare 2 answers to this question, Donald Davidson's and Sean Gallagher's. Neither Davidson nor Gallagher follow Hume in looking inward and searching for an elusive self when looking for myself, and then famously stumbling on nothing but perceptions. They do have that in common. They do not look inward, but their accounts of the subjective, I'm borrowing the term subjective from Thomas Nagel. That's the organizing theme for the talk. Their accounts of the subjective are remarkably, I would say, dissimilar. So Davidson proposes a language-based account of the subjective as first-person authority, whereas Sean Gallagher proposes what we can call a phenomenology-inspired account of immunity to error through misidentification in proprioception. I will call it IEM for short. As we will see, their respective focuses on language and perception lead them in quite different directions when pursuing a view of the subjective. And this is why I thought it could be fruitful to play them against each other. So, how do we go about answering Hume's question, where am I or what, and not looking inside for a self? Let's start with Davidson's way. I called it meaning what we say and knowing what we mean. In his articles on the subjective, collected in the 2001 volume Subjective, Intersubjective, Objective, Davidson defends that subjectivity, the topic of the conference, is nothing but first-person authority. Once we get rid of the Cartesian idea of subjectivity as a parade of objects before the mind, objects such that they must be what they seem and seem what they are, all we are left with, Davidson says, is privacy and asymmetry. Notice that by saying this, he's rejecting the idea that there is no difference in type between self-knowledge and knowledge of other minds. So unlike, say, Gilbert Ryle, he does accept a doctrine of privileged access. But he does that in a very deflationary tone. This is how he puts things. In order to know what other, let's take the two questions. How do I know what other people think, and compare it to the answer to the question, what do I know what I think? In order to know what other people think, I do need evidence, and I do take as evidence what they say and do. But how can it be that in my own case I don't have to appeal to any evidence at all in order to know what I think? His answer, Davidson's answer, is that there is an assumption which is built in the very nature of interpretation, according to which a speaker usually knows what he means, whereas there is no presupposition, no such presupposition in the interpretation of others. So this is what he calls first-person authority, and first-person authority is thus, I'm quoting him, a necessary feature of the interpretation of speech. So, Davidson's approach to the subjective, what is he doing in his approach to the subjective? He's talking about self-knowledge, and he's talking about self-knowledge as knowledge of one's own thoughts. And he's posing the question in terms of language and interpretation. And it is as such that the subjective is dealt with as a part of his program, which, as you all know, is an inquiry into the very possibility of thought and of objective knowledge. So, in the myth, in the article called The Myth of the Subjective, Davidson does acknowledge that this phenomenon, first-person authority, may give rise to an idea of epistemic priority of thought to world, and thus to skepticism. But his account is, I said, deflationary precisely in that his first-person authority is both more basic and much less significant epistemologically than Cartesian epistemic authority. It is simply a matter, we could say, of our condition as linguistic creatures. And this is a condition in which I know what I mean when I say what I mean, but somehow that is the deepest access I have to what I think. To this, it should be added that there is no transparency of content of my thoughts to myself. Davidson is a content externalist. Before we take this to be a very trivial and a very insufficient view of the subjective, we should keep in mind that Davidson's view of the subjective is put forward as part of what I would call an extremely ambitious philosophical program that has many different parts to it, from philosophy of action to ontology to philosophy of language. The account of the subjective, Davidson's account of the subjective, is part of an investigation into the very possibility of objective knowledge and thought in minds such as our own, which, as you probably all know, builds on a Tarskian theory of truth and uses it as a theory of interpretation for natural languages, our use of natural languages, the so-called radical interpretation, and then ends up in a proposal to relate, in the volume I referred to relate the objective, the intersubjective, and the subjective. Davidson calls it the tripod. And the tripod is what he thinks is needed for conceiving of the thought-world relations, and that's his true goal. So ultimately, Davidson's core claim is that subjective, intersubjective, and objective come together, and only when this tripod is in place can there be, for instance, for Davidson, a thing such as a belief, mine or yours, for instance, that these hands are mine, a belief about the objective world, a belief which can be true, as opposed to, say, passing glimpses, which have, in my mind, in your mind, which have no claim to objectivity or truth. Anyway, even allowing for for this ambition, the fact is that Davidson's approach to the subjective takes place within an interpretation theory. And an interpretation theory, as such, simply assumes that there is something out there to be interpreted. And so its touchstone is, as you probably know, behavioral evidence, so ultimately stimuli. In other words, in spite of his well-known criticisms of Quine, a view from the outside, I would call it, so a priority of third-person perspective, is at the core of Davidson's philosophy, and thus at the very heart of his view of the subjective. And this is not a contingent detail. It is connected, actually, with another problem. I won't go into there now. I'm currently much interested in perception, philosophy of perception, but this is not at all that. But I would say about Davidson that there's a complete lack of a view of perception in Davidson's philosophy, and that he shows in his very view of the web of belief, and the idea that all there is stimuli, and then the web of belief, including perceptual beliefs. Anyway, leaving perception out of the picture, Davidson leaves our being acquainted with our own bodily being out of the picture. So even if Davidson's view of the subjective as first-person authority gives us, I believe, very important ideas, above all, separating first-person authority and epistemic privilege, but also the importance of the subjective, intersubjective, objective tripod in accounting for the nature of human thought. His version of, to use my expression, of my encountering myself, of one's encountering oneself, leaves us with something like an isolation in language and by language, leaves us with something I would call a worldly subjectivity. And so it may seem that there is something missing here. So, next proposal, Sean Gallagher's. I called it Reintroducing Perspective and Perception. Sean Gallagher on IEM. One place to look, if we are looking for an alternative to approaches such as Davidson's, are approaches to this phenomenon, the phenomenon of immunity to error through misidentification, focusing on proprioception. And my example here is going to be Sean Gallagher. In a 2012 article called Immunity to Error Through Misidentification in the First Person, published in a book I edited with a German colleague, a book on consciousness and subjectivity, he defends IEM in proprioception against claims of people such as John Campbell, Elisabeth Pachery, French philosopher he died, Marc Jeanneret, a French neuroscientist. So, in this article, he defends IEM in proprioception against the claims that I will describe of people such as John Campbell, Elisabeth Pachery, and Marc Jeanneret. In the case of Campbell, he proposed that experiences such as hallucinations, thought insertion, delusions of control, in which, for instance, schizophrenic subjects report that their body is under the control of other people, are all counterexamples to IEM. I'm speaking mostly of a 1999 article by Campbell called Schizophrenia, the Space of Reasons and Thinking as a Motor Process. In the case of Pachery and Jeanneret, I'm thinking of a very interesting 2004 Mind and Language article of theirs called Agency, Simulation and Self-Identification, where they consider an even wider range of examples and conclude that such exceptions are sufficient for rejecting IEM, for rejecting the principle. They say, in a nutshell, then, the bad news for philosophers, they think this is very bad news for philosophers, is that self-identification is, after all, a problem. In the domain of action and intention, at least, there is no such thing as immunity to error through misidentification, whether for the self as object, which they identify with sense of ownership, or for the self as subject, which they identify with sense of agency. The mechanisms involved in self and other attribution may be reasonably reliable, but they are not infallible. In other words, IEM obtains only contingently, so it is not philosophically very important. Gallagher does acknowledge in the article I'm referring to that exceptions to IEM are abound in both clinical and experimental situations. One's misidentifications of oneself range from, for instance, phenomena such as somatoparaphrenia, where you can have a patient identifying, denying the ownership of a limb connected to their body, such as if now I say this arm is not mine, even if After that, they can, for instance, look at the mirror, see their own image, and then, as it were, repossess this limb whose ownership was denied, from somatoparaphenia to the phenomenon of rubber hand illusion I mentioned at the beginning, to virtual whole body displacement phenomena, to inserted thoughts in schizophrenic patients, etc. Yet, Gallagher, acknowledging all this, he believes that the principle, I-E-M, still holds of proprioception. Exceptions can be, he thinks, accounted for, as we will see, by isolating, he says, a conception of the subjective as irreducible perspective, isolating it from things that should not go there, namely self-ownership and the feeling of agency. But I will, before I go into that, I just want to go look back a little into the history of the discussion of the phenomena of IAM. I don't know if you are all familiar now with this discussion. So, when Sidney Shoemaker introduced, following Wittgenstein, the term IAM, immunity to error through misidentification, what he had in mind, what he was after in his self-reference and self-awareness paper, was the use of the first person pronoun I, and in the self-ascription of mental experience. So in my attributing thoughts to myself. In the varieties of reference chapter on self-identification, from which the scenario I used at the beginning was extracted, Evans explored the fact that this phenomenon, IEM, seems to extend from self-attribution of mental experience to me to proprioception. And at that time, for a larger or more ambitious version of this paper, this Evans against Nagel would be really important to me. At that time, I'm talking about the 1980s, Evans was formulating his position against Thomas Nagel's view of the subjective. You probably all are familiar with it from the view from nowhere and what is it like to be a bat. A view of the subjective, according to which I cannot possibly think of myself as something in the world, me as subjective experience, me as a center of consciousness. I cannot conceive of myself as something in the world as it is anyway, as Bernard Williams would put it. So Nagel basically thinks we cannot make sense of our own perspective as subjects as being part of an objective world. We cannot successfully locate consciousness in the objectively represented world. From this, he concludes for the existence, as you all know, of a gulf between the objective and the subjective, and posits what he terms an essentially perspectival subjective reality. Usually we don't look so much at the metaphysical implications of Nagel's claims in philosophy of mind, but this is a step he himself does not refrain from taking. So Evans rejects Nagel's conclusion, Nagel's metaphysical conclusion from this impossibility of locating consciousness in the objectively represented world, because he thinks it simply presupposes idealism, an idealism that Evans does not want to go along with. Anyway. In the case of Evans, Nagel, he believes that our thoughts about ourselves are in no way hospitable to Cartesianism. If there is to be a division between the mental and the physical, this is a division which is spanned by the ideas, that's the term he uses for conceptions, we have of ourselves. Our customary use of I simply spans the gap between the mental and the physical. In other words, going back to Gallagher, this was just a detour on history of IAM. Evans thinks there must be something wrong with Wittgenstein's initial distinction between the subjective and the objective uses of I, as he formulated them, namely in the blue and brown books. The distinction would go somehow like this. If I experience a toothache, it would be completely nonsensical to say, someone has a toothache, is it me? On the other hand, for example, looking in the mirror and seeing a sunburned arm, a mirror in front of me, I might say, I have a sunburn, but it is possible that I'm seeing someone else's arm in the mirror and I'm mistaking it for my own. And in that sense, I seem to be misidentifying myself while referring to myself as object. And these two situations would be straight asymmetrical, and there would be a straight division between them. Anyway, Evans' scenario that I mentioned at the beginning, the having my legs crossed, and can I be wrong here, is formulated precisely in the wake of the criticism of Wittgenstein's distinction. So I'll repeat the scenario. The scenario was from Varieties of Reference, chapter on self-identification, is this: my legs are crossed. I'm sitting here, my legs are crossed, they're mine, I feel them, they are my legs and they are crossed. I cannot be wrong, or can I? What if wires are messed up with and my brain is getting stimulation from A's legs? Can I feel legs that are not mine, as me? So, back to Gallagher. He's trying in his 2012 article to deal with all these cases of misidentification, supposed exceptions to the principle, and defending that the principle still stands. So, the article itself is prompted by Evans' challenge. And in the article, each case, all these, the cases I've mentioned till now are all referred to, so they are cases that he gets from psychiatry, from neurology, from cognitive science, so from somatoparaphrenia to thought insertion to rubber hand illusion. And those are all cases, now we can simply put it like this, of mistakenly identifying a body or body parts or thoughts or actions other than my own as being mine or being me, as well as cases of not identifying my body or body parts or thoughts or actions as being mine. All of them seem to be exceptions, to work as exceptions to the principle IEM. So these are all ways I can go wrong in taking myself to be the experiencer of my experiences, the thinker of my thoughts, the author of my actions, the owner of my body. So, question. How can IE, and the question for Gallagher, how can IEM possibly still hold if there are all these exceptions? Gallagher's answer is that we need to do some work here. We need to bring apart what he calls the senses of self-agency and self-ownership, which are in normal cases indistinguishable. He thinks we can, in fact, distinguish them in our sense of mindness or ipseity. For instance, an involuntary movement of my body can make the distinction clear. If somebody pushes me from behind, there is sense of ownership of my movement, but not sense of agency. It is, as it were, a movement of me, of this thing, yet it is not, I'm not authoring it. So, sense of ownership is, in Gallagher's phenomenology-inspired terminology, the pre-reflective experience that I am the one undergoing the experience. In contrast, sense of agency is the pre-reflective experience that I am the one causing or generating movement of this body. And in his closer look at the sense of mindness, he carefully distinguishes them. And he's also, that's also part of the work he's doing, explicitly committed to a phenomenological conception of experience as pre-reflective self-acquaintance. In your reference in the handout, you could, for instance, check Gallagher and Zahavi 2010. And such conception is, as it were, step number one for defending IEM against the claims of people such as Jeanne Rodin-Pachery or John Campbell. Step number two is then proposing that IEM, in order to stand, should be kept as independent as possible from particular modes of access to self, which are indeed fallible and subject to manipulation, as all the experimental cases and pathologies show. So he claims that there is only one aspect of experience which, in his words, remains self-specific and retains the characteristic of IEM. And this is what he calls first-person perspective. And he means first-person perspective only, and not the sense of ownership, not the sense of agency. Problem is, what is first-person perspective then for Gallagher? His answer, I'm just quoting it, is that it is the non-relative bodily framework that acts as the origin point of the perspective, and which, in action and perception, is manifested in the integration of the non-relative bodily framework and the egocentric spatial framework of reference. This, he thinks, this spatial perspective and origin is what he thinks survives manipulation of our senses of ownership and of agency, even in cases such as the rubber hand illusion, somatoparaphrenia, thought insertion, etc., etc. So even in all these cases, there is first-person perspective, and first-person perspective is still mine. I am the subject to whom I refer when, for instance, I claim this arm is not mine, or these thoughts are not mine. thinking I'm a schizophrenic, thinking kill God. Such embodied first-person perspective is, according to Gallagher, part of every action and perception qua experiences. It is, he thinks, more basic than the linguistic phenomena of self-identification or self-reference that are at stake in the cases I alluded to at the beginning, the Marc, Castaneda, Perry cases. And he also thinks that this is not contingent. Anyway, remember I was trying to compare two approaches to the subjective, Davidson's and Gallagher's. And my general question was, what can we learn for pursuing, from this comparison, from this trying to have them clash against each other, what can we learn for pursuing a view of the subjective? Something like Gallagher's phenomenology-inspired account of the subjective should, I think, be brought up against Davidson's view, where the worldly situatedness of the subjective is simply lost. But is this irreducible perspective, Gallagher's irreducible perspective, that is part of every perception and action, a spatial irreducible perspective, is this all we want from a view of the subjective? This is the question I want to answer. Following Gallagher, we leave completely behind Davidson's ambition when he puts forward a view of the subjective. And what was Davidson's ambition? To, as it were, claim that a view of the subjective belongs in a framework of problems, of thought and knowledge. So it belongs in a framework of, we could say, epistemological and metaphysical worries. So a view of the subjective should be part of our general answer to the thought-world relation question. Whereas Gallagher's approach is mostly, I would say, psychological and cognitive. And if we simply, in searching for a view of the subjective, if we simply replace Davidson's proposal with a proposal such as Gallagher's, we are not simply getting the same work done by a view of the subjective. So I want to suggest that although Gallagher does indeed point at something which I think is missing in Davidson's account of the subjective as encountering oneself, as the phenomenon of first-person authority in encountering oneself, not everything is wrong in Davidson. So let us grant that first-person perspective is indeed irreducible in a way which an interpretation theory such as Davidson's, with its stimuli, language dualism, with its a-wordliness, cannot account for. And a phenomenological approach simply seems to fare better here. Still, spatial, self-locating perspective, so Gallagher's take on the subjective, is not all I would suggest that we are after when we pursue a view of the subjective. Question is, why? Because such view is not by itself sufficient for answering questions regarding truth, thought, and knowledge in which, according to Davidson, a view of the subjective is and should be involved. In order to pursue such questions, we have to come to terms not only with Gallagher's spatial first-person perspective, but also with two facts. The fact that we are all first persons and in the world. This is what Davidson is actually after in his essays on the subjective, the intersubjective, and the objective. And his way of thinking about what he calls the tripod, so subjective, intersubjective, objective, may not be the best. There's plenty to criticize there. We started with a lack of view of perception. But he's right, I think, to place a view of the subjective within a search for what he himself calls the shared standards of truth and objectivity that the very possibility of thought demands. That said, in favor of Davidson, Gallagher's move, bringing in the spatial character of perspective, may prove very important, and this was the global, more ambitious project for this paper, may prove very important in not going Nagel's way in conceiving of the subjective. Nagel thinks that we can simply not make sense, remember, of our own, of consciousness as belonging in the natural world. So as our own, we cannot make sense of our perspective as subjects as being part of the world. And he takes a step from that inconceivability claim to what Naomi Island, British philosopher from Warwick, calls the metaphysical elusiveness claim, according to which I stands for something external to the empirical world, stands for a metaphysical subject. So, when nowadays people in the philosophy of psychology, such as Eileen herself or John Campbell, I was referring to before, when they see the task of relating spatial thought and objectivity is very important, and important not only for the philosophy of psychology, but also for epistemological and metaphysical purposes, they see it as a way of not taking Nagel's step. So the step from the inconceivability claim to the metaphysical elusiveness claim. They are saying, we can indeed make sense of our own perspective as subjects, as being part of the objective world, and spelling this out should be an important component in a view of the subjective/intersubjective/objective. And so I want to end with a quote by someone who would certainly agree with this. He's not there anymore, Evans, who, in the varieties of reference, put it like that. Any thinker who has an idea of an objective spatial world, an idea of a world of objects and phenomena which can be perceived but which are not dependent on being perceived for their existence, such thinker must be able to think of his perception of the world as being simultaneously due to his position in the world and to the condition of the world at that position. The very idea of a perceivable, objective, spatial world brings with it the idea of a subject being in the world. The idea that there is an objective world and the idea that the subject is somewhere cannot be separated, and where he is given as what he can perceive. So this is it. Thank you.
So thank you very much. Thank you very much. This is very interesting, and we have some time for questions. So first, Robert.
I was reading particularly sort of Gallagher and the related stuff you were talking about a while ago, of course, which is quite familiar with. You sort of framed it in a way which I didn't quite remember, but it's brought something out which I just want to. So let me get to the point. The point is that so first person perspective. It looks like the way you're reading out, I think you're probably right. I just didn't remember it this way. Is that the first person perspective, because, and you can correct me when I go wrong, right? Because ownership and agency can be alienated in schizophrenia or in other conditions, they're not basic. So they're not basic to the first person perspective. That's the bit I hadn't realised that's what he was arguing, but that sounds at least a very plausible way of going with it. So now we've got a problem which you brought up.
What remains?
Yeah, well, what's left, really? And so it sounds like then spatiality is left. Now that's clearly didn't have much time to really talk about that, but that's quite bare, isn't it? It's the first bare. It's not. There's not. It seems like on the face of it, that's not very much. And it seems, for instance, a very long way from if you think about people like Nagel talking about the first person perspective. It seems if we're left with spatiality, we're left with something. There's almost, on the first blush, it looks like there's almost not much to it. So that's a bit worrying, actually.
Not much, you mean metaphysics, Nagel style?
Yeah, if you're trying to build I think this is exactly what you're saying, so maybe I'm just, but it seems like it doesn't seem like much of a basis to build that kind of metaphysics, or even really, I'm not sure that's what people, when people talk about the first person perspective, they're generally, if it turns out that all they're talking about is some sort of spatiality, people would generally be surprised. And it's even more surprising coming from somebody like Gallagher, because, you know, they want to build quite a lot, generally seem to want to build a lot into pre-reflective, self-experience. So this basic experience of, pre-reflective experience of self. So the thing that started really worrying me, though, as you were talking, I now start to think about schizophrenia and things like inserted thoughts or hearing voices, right? So one idea about that, coming from the kind of Campbell literature, is when somebody with schizophrenia hears a voice, they've lost the motor copy, they've lost the sense that they're the agent of that voice, so they can hear the speech. A weird thing about that is that if you think about inner speech, maybe this becomes a bit contentious now, but if you think about something like inner speech, it's not clear that there's a spatial dimension to it. Right. If you think...
That's why you were just in our hallucinations workshop, and the fact that verbal hallucinations are so important in the actual symptomatology of schizophrenia kind of subverts the usual concentration on visual illusions that philosophers are really keen on.
Okay, yes. So maybe maybe I just want to hear you talk a bit more about that, but I'll cut my question short. It seems like, if we take Gallagher's sort of claims at face value, they don't even cover the cases he wants to go to, because it seems like now there's nothing sort of basic about some things which seem to be basic, you know. So what's the basic thing about, so maybe I've got this wrong, let me try and say it.
Robert, may I just say something about what you've been saying?
Yeah.
My general perception about the first-person literature is that it's hugely disparate. So that's why I started with cases that I think do not even go into the same boat. So there's topics that people in philosophy of language are interested in, so self-reference. There are things that people in philosophy of mind are more interested in, and Gallagher would count there. So I don't think they can even be dealt with the same instruments, conceptual instruments. And then the question arises whether this is a genuinely philosophical important phenomenon, this first-person perspective and this phenomenon of immunity to error through misidentification. I tend to agree with Pachery and General claim that there's nothing philosophically very important there. Okay, so and this will have to do with our coming to terms with our encountering oneself as we encounter other things in the world. But sorry, I interrupted. That was just the basic line behind this. We have all these completely different phenomena. We are not going to be able to deal with them with the same conceptual instruments. Aren't we kind of fetishizing this first-person perspective topic as being one sole topic?
Yeah, well, maybe that might. Okay, maybe it comes to that. So, sorry, I'll just try and finish the thought on inner speech. So it seems like. Okay. Maybe I can't do it now, actually. So that was the point. So it seems like we're not left with very much. It's worry about that, and maybe we can talk a bit more about that afterwards.
No, but your basic question was about verbal hallucinations and there being nothing particularly spatial in the first-person perspective that's left there. And so that could be framed as a criticism to Gallagher's proposal on first-person perspective. Well, he does use the metaphor of the origin, the locatedness as when spelling out this spatial perspective. And origin and locatedness and oneness of origin and locatedness are still there in the verbal hallucinations case, no?
Seems a bit unconvincing.
Okay.
Okay, I have a very simple question. Okay, what would Davidson and Gallagher answer, if they were asked, in your opinion, to the question whether non-human animals have subjectivity or not?
Davidson is famous for denying that 3-month-old infants and snails are rational creatures, so they're not conscious, they're not rational, so Davidson's answer would be that. Davidson is very differently positioned because of his pre-reflective self-acquaintedness take on the nature of experience. He would have to say something completely different, I think. So,
and Gallagher?
Sorry?
And Gallagher?
My second answer was about Gallagher. So since he takes this phenomenological definition of experience as pre-reflective self-awareness, that might very well describe both us and other animals. Davidson is in trouble.
Okay, thank you.
So, very short last question, because we are...
Can't we marry Davidson and Gallagher by transferring a Davidsonian network of subjective into objective into the bodily self-awareness as studied by Gallagher, so that to understand the first person perspective and agency as non-individual, externalist, somehow having the genesis, intersubjective genesis and structure.
Thanks a lot for that question. That was the spirit of the paper, actually, marrying Davidson and Gallagher in the sense of keeping the subjective, intersubjective, objective, but then what I think is valuable in Gallagher is this actually positioning in the world the notion of experience. So I would say that those philosophers of psychology I mentioned, briefly, Naomi Island or John Campbell, in much what they are doing in their work in philosophy of psychology are after that. Because, for instance, when they are searching for the origins of objectivity in spatial thought, they are actually trying to marry these two ideas, so exactly as you put it. Thank you.
Oh, okay, Sofia, thank you very much.